This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast, part of the Sinica Network from SupChina. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I am your host, Jared Turner, longtime resident of China, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series, and 4 out of 5 people are good at mathematics, but the other 2 struggle. My co-host is John Paston, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of AllSet Learning, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, Sinosplice.com, and once won a scariest tarantula contest with an empty box. Think about it. John and I are going to talk about something close to our heart, reading in Chinese. We're going to discuss the different types of reading and specifically how you can harness the power of extensive reading to accelerate your Chinese. Guest interviews with Sebastian Mueller from Germany, who moved to China, studied Chinese, and in addition to his day job, is a growing personality on Chinese social media. All this and more, let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner coming at you from Utah in the United States.
Hey everybody, I am John Pasden. I'm in Shanghai, China. How's it going?
All right, John, I am looking forward to this episode today. But before we kick into things, we do have a couple of reviews. You want to kick us off?
All right, so this one is from Kendra in the U.S. on Apple Podcasts, and she, I guess that's a she, says, "The best. Still love this podcast. Not only has it helped me study Mandarin better, it has also helped me teach my students English better. Love the most recent episode about dialects. I am in Henan right now, and sometimes if older people want to talk to me, they only speak Henan Hua. So hard. My students ask me if I can speak Henan Hua, and if I answer using the 1 or 2 words I do know, they laugh uproariously. Funny story. Right before I came here, I met a Chinese person in the U.S., and I told her I was moving here and wanted to learn Mandarin, and she told me do not learn the Henan accent, or I would sound like a thug. I don't know if she meant Henan Hua or just an accent, but it's pretty funny. I don't know if I sound like a thug or not. Since COVID, traveling anywhere in or out of China can be difficult, so I haven't asked anyone not from Henan. Have you guys heard of any other associations with other particular accent? The way we might consider a British accent to be more refined for some reason? Okay. So, I got to say, the prejudice against people from Henan in China is alive and well. I have heard this, and I rarely go to Henan. I've been there, but it's been a while. But yeah, they're called thieves, thugs, and so the accent is not really desired.
But they're not really thieves and thugs. Although there may
be a few, but I know only good Henan people, so... I vote for the good people of Henan getting a break.
I second the notion.
All right, so Jared, what do you got?
All right. We have a second review. This comes from .None. Okay. All right, Mr. Nunn. All right. She says, this podcast is unlike any other I've found. It doesn't teach Chinese. It highlights experiences and resources and ideas that help you succeed, however you are learning. Learning Chinese can feel like training for an ultra marathon. You Can Learn Chinese can help. Each episode has regular segments, including my favorite part, an interview with someone that brings a new perspective on this endeavor. Hearing how other people have overcome the challenges I'm facing is priceless. I'm often finding something new to try, but I also find so much motivation in hearing about the experiences people have had. The hosts are fantastic. Hey. They also produce one of the most helpful Chinese learning resources out there, Mandarin Companion Graded Readers. Jared is great. Hey, someone thinks I'm great. And John Pasden is, John Pasden. Is that good or bad, John?
Yeah, is that good or bad? What comes next?
Well, she puts parentheses around this. She says, Sinosplice, the Grammar Wiki, Years at Chinese Pod, also runs AllSet Learning for one-on-one tutoring, and the Grammar Wiki and Level, curated book form. Okay, so it's positive, I think.
Hopefully. Thank you.
Positive. Few people know more about the many ways to learn Chinese. These guys are fun, motivating, and they know their stuff. Hey, well, thanks, None. None.
Thanks so much, None.
from the United States, so we really appreciate it.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about one of the things that we started out talking about, and it's always a common thread. We're talking about reading and reading Chinese. And not just reading Chinese, but like types of reading and techniques for reading. We're not going to teach you a new way to read, but we are going to talk about different ways of reading and how they relate to Chinese and how this relates to your Chinese studies.
So these are things we do touch on in the podcast, but I think it's time here. Let's bring all this together and really hit this straight on.
Yeah, and I should start by saying that this is a super complicated topic. Like, there's been so much research into this. Like, psychologists and all kinds of linguists, they've studied, what are people really doing? What's happening in their brain when they're reading? And it's surprisingly complex. So one word that we're going to use is decoding. Decoding is basically looking at symbols, figuring out the language they represent, and then you're going to be able to comprehend it.
Yeah, this concept of decoding, I think anyone listening is going to be familiar with this. My reference language, my native language is English. If I come across an English word I do not know, I will sit there and I'll kind of maybe try to sound it out or parse it out, and then I'll be able to pronounce it. So that's decoding a word, and just on the pronunciation and actually implying what does that mean, maybe a few more steps. But in Chinese, this is also obviously one of the challenges of Chinese. You come across a character you don't know. It's just our ability to decode it, especially at lower levels, is just not there. Even at advanced levels, you may not be able to decode it at all.
Yeah, the really interesting thing about decoding is that it doesn't just go from like a symbol to meaning and then understanding. Actually, there's this intermediary step of sound. So when we first start learning to read, we say the words out loud, and then we hear them, and then we understand them. And, when you're reading silently, a lot of us still hear the words in our mind, or if we don't, there's something kind of like that happening, and scientists don't totally understand. But you kind of need that as an intermediary step for comprehension. And this is what makes things really interesting, because some languages are more phonetic, like English, but then you still have words like, of or the or who, which are sight words, and they're not phonetic. You just have to memorize them. And then there's also all these words that don't obey those spelling rules, words like tough and cough and dough and through, and they all rhyme, but they're spelled crazy. So English is not totally phonetic, right?
Which is okay. It's normal. Every language is going to have its own ambiguities, right? And I think this is one thing, put that out right there, is that every language has ambiguities like that. That things it just doesn't make sense.
Peculiarities.
Why do we have to do it this way? Why is it pronounced that way? That's just what it is.
Yeah, so English is one of those languages that's more phonetic than not, but it's not entirely phonetic. And then Chinese is also not entirely logographic. It's not just symbols, because you have all these characters that are composed of phonetic components. So there is an element of the phonetic in the Chinese, but then what people are trying to figure out is, well, when you decode Chinese and it's not mostly phonetic, then is it totally different? What happens? And I just want to put a quote here about decoding, because I think it's a nice way to sum up this whole concept, which is, a general agreement of the contemporary reading models is that there exists an interaction between phonological and semantic processing involved in the computation from print to sound.
All right, John, could you maybe unwrap that for us? Explain this. What does that mean?
All right, so there's some kind of interaction going on in our brain between like symbols that are not phonetic and symbols that are phonetic. And somehow the symbols on the paper or on the screen are being converted into sound, and then we're understanding. And that is decoding. So what I just want to point out here is that Chinese has more of the symbols. There's like this semantic, this interpreting these pictogram / logogram characters that are not phonetic sometimes, and that does complicate things. So that's going to color all the rest of what we talk about today. So I think one aspect of this decoding challenge for Chinese, we feel it when we open up a book entirely in Chinese and just see the wall of characters, right? We've all been there. Like the first time you opened up a Chinese book that was just all Chinese with no pictures, and it's not a textbook. It's just, it's overwhelming. Just the idea that you can even...
It's like a black hole. It's going to suck you in.
It's scary. And because Chinese is also so dense, right? So let's talk about the reading techniques and how Chinese affects those. So when I talk about techniques, I'm basically talking about what you're doing while you're reading, like different ways of reading, right? Or sometimes it's why you're reading. So the first one, for example, is skimming. And skimming is something that you use a lot when you're researching, and you're basically doing a quick read, just trying to pick up the general idea of the passage or the paper. And you're not reading every word. You're trying to just identify some keywords. and just figure out if you want to read it in depth or maybe just get a general idea of what it's about.
I think something that's important to note, on this, John, is with English and other, phonetically spelled languages, we are not sounding out words when we are skimming or reading. For example, you brought up the word like through, strength, things like that, where if you see that word, you're not sounding it out. It becomes actually a sight word, and you just can see the word and you recognize it. I think a good example is if you've ever seen any one of these, fun little, exercise. I don't know what to call it, an exercise or what else. Just something that's interesting is they'll take, a sentence or a paragraph, and they found that if you take a word and you keep the first and the last letter the same, and you can mix up all the words in the middle, all the letters in the middle of that word, people can still read it.
Oh, yeah, I've seen those. There's
a familiarity between the word. What's that called?
I don't know what it's called, but yeah, I think probably most of our listeners are familiar with that.
Yeah, so essentially our brain just can recognize the words, and it's only when we have unfamiliarity with a word is that we want to take the time to actually sound it out and make sure we understand, hey, how's that pronounced? So I think it's one of the interesting things. I think that in the end, the reading process, how our brain actually recognizes and reads between Chinese and English, there's going to be a lot of more similarities than not. It's just getting to that point of being able to actually recognize the character or word so that it's in our mind, it's in our memory.
Right, and we were talking before about how English has some sight words, and you have to learn to recognize these words quickly. And it just takes longer with Chinese because you have to learn to recognize both characters and words. And, when you're skimming, to be able to quickly, look over something and know what it's about, you have to be very quickly recognizing a whole bunch of words. And you're not thinking about them a whole lot, but you're still recognizing them quickly. So in order to skim in Chinese, you have to get to this level where you can quickly recognize not just the characters, but the words, and then make some sense of it so that you can keep going. And let me tell you, I've been in China for 21 years. I did my master's entirely in Chinese, and getting to the point where I could skim in Chinese was very hard. It took a long time. It took me a lot longer than I expected because there's just so much, so many characters you have to be pretty familiar with,
Well, I think this also underscores an important aspect in regards to reading Chinese that we just don't talk about a lot, and that's parsing the language. One of the reasons that Chinese looks so intimidating when you first open the book is that, yes, you don't know the characters, but they're all in just a solid block, There's no spaces between the words. Yeah, we'll have commas and periods and maybe some other punctuation, but you've got to be familiar enough with the words, not just the characters, but the words, so that you can actually begin to mentally parse it in your mind. And so if you're skimming like that, it takes even more brain power because you have to do that even on a more quicker way and not just pick out characters but actually be able to quickly parse, right, words that have meaning.
Yeah, like imagine if you're trying to skim an article in English and someone removed all the spaces and converted all the capitals to lowercase. Like, that would be a nightmare. But that's basically what you're doing for Chinese and then some. So, we're not trying to really sell you on this idea that Chinese is hard. But I'm just saying skimming as a skill is definitely significantly more challenging in Chinese. And you will get there if you keep at it. You just have to keep reading for a while. You have to get really familiar, and you have to build up your fluency in reading, which is not something that you're going to do with flashcards or with just, endless HSK tests. Okay, so that is skimming. It's a useful skill, but it's going to take some time. Oh, one other thing I want to mention that about skimming is that it's really important if you're trying to figure out whether or not you want to read something. And so I think that's something that a lot of kind of lower level advanced students struggle with. It's like, I want to read more Chinese. Every time I take out an article, it takes me 15 minutes to even figure out what it's about. And then I realize I don't want to read it. And yeah, I feel your pain. That's why we created that ARC newsletter, right? And you just got to push through that. You got to get your reading, faster, get more familiar, get more fluent, and you can do it. You can do it.
Now that leads us to our next technique of scanning.
Yeah, so scanning is when you're like trying to find a word or phrase in an article. Maybe you're doing multiple choice and you're trying to find the part of the article that talks about it, or maybe you're just trying to find the part that talks about, that movie star you like or whatever. So as you might have guessed, this is a bit challenging in Chinese as well, because not only are there no spaces, and not only are you dealing with characters, but when you think about it, a word in English, especially if it's a proper noun, it has length. It's pretty long. But in Chinese, a lot of times you're talking about one or two characters, and it's a smaller spot on a relatively dense collection of text. So scanning is, it's probably going to go more slowly in Chinese as well.
Yeah, it's a little bit more akin to finding that needle in a haystack. So, I think, on scanning as well, we're specifically looking for something. And I think sometimes, we're looking at skimming and scanning. We can do both, or sometimes are doing both, right? And so I think overall is maybe let's look at what are kind of the benefits of doing this. Why would we want to do this?
So skimming is when you're trying to get a general feel for what a text is about, maybe to find out if you want to read it. And then scanning is when you're looking for some specific information. Like I want to know if this article about COVID talks about, the third booster shot or whatever, then you're probably going to scan and look for some specific words.
All right, that sounds great. So I think, whatever your purposes are, these are some techniques and stuff that you're going to need to build, and it's going to take a little while to grow.
Okay, so the next one is less kind of utilitarian. It's called active reading. So active reading is just really engaging with the text because you really want to learn it and you want to understand it. You're not trying to do this quick. You're trying to do it right. So like Jared, when you think of active reading, what do you think of?
I think maybe I'm reading some instructions, that I need to get something done. So I'm paying very close attention. Or maybe I would think of maybe like a test, right? A reading comprehension. I'm make sure I'm really paying attention to what's going on here so I can be able to answer the questions.
Right. And if you're doing it for your own learning, then you might be taking notes or you might be, marking up the book or with a highlighter or whatever, if that's what you do. So you're trying to interact with the text and you're thinking about what you're reading also.
Yeah. So this is not fast reading. It's deliberate. You may be able to read quickly, but you're not necessarily just blowing right through it. And I think in my experience, John, this type of active reading, it's usually not just like story, right? It's maybe not just like novel content. This might be something with more informational, right? Where you're trying to come away with something from this. Right.
Reading. If it's a novel, then you're probably doing it for English class or something like that, not just to enjoy. And studies have shown that active reading is slower for nonfiction content because it's usually for educational stuff. So I think this active reading is something that our listeners are most familiar with. You might be using a dictionary in this case as well, whereas you wouldn't if you're skimming or scanning.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so those are 3 reading techniques. Let's get into different types of reading. All of this is tied together. It's all relevant. And then types of reading, we're going to talk about your relationship to comprehension of the text. So how well are you understanding what you're reading? And this is obviously specifically relevant to learning a foreign language and becoming literate in that language.
So in general, we talk about 3 different levels of reading. So we talk about extensive reading, intensive reading, and reading pain. Now, technically, there is a 4th one where you say like speed reading. This is where you have 100% comprehension. But that's usually not the case for us Chinese learners. So real first, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to just talk about reading pain and what this is. So you know that when we're talking about extensive reading, intensive reading, what we're not talking about. Now, reading pain is when you're reading below a 90% level of comprehension. Perhaps, I think we've all done this at some point. It's slow. You need a dictionary or some sort of, pop-up dictionaries if you're online. You might spend a half an hour going through just a paragraph or 2, and by the time you get through it, you're not even sure what you just read.
Oh, yeah. Been there.
Okay. So the research shows that this is not like optimal. We do not learn well at this level. Yeah, you might say, oh, look, I got this paragraph and it's got, 20 new characters in it. I've learned these characters. No, you didn't. All right. Because when you're reading at such a low level of comprehension like that, what happens is that you begin actually, instead of understanding it in Chinese, you're understanding it in your native language because you're using the dictionary all the time. and you're not getting enough repetition of these words to really see them again and again, so that it really becomes implanted in your mind. And additionally, you don't have a lot of context. Okay, yeah, these characters and things that you're learning are in context in a paragraph, but your overall comprehension is very low. And so you're not able to understand it all well. And just like I said, by the time you get to the end of the paragraph, you're not even sure what you read. So, I mean, bottom line is that there are people you'll hear who have learned this way and have plotted through like a novel in Chinese and learned Chinese that way. But for every one person that's done that, I guarantee you there are 1,000 people that dropped out, right? Said, oh, it's just too hard. So it's demotivating. It's painful. They call it reading pain for a reason. So we do not recommend reading pain. You will have stages and points, and even points in a book where you go through some reading pain, but you will learn best when you're reading at higher levels of comprehension.
Yeah, I think we all like our pain in low doses, infrequent. We recommend that.
Yes. There's some no pain, no gain, right? I mean, there's going to be some of that element, but if it's always that way, you might be doing something wrong.
All right, and also the closer you get to 90%, then the less painful it is. And sometimes maybe you have to deal with 89%. But then you're starting to get into the intensive reading category, which is a little more tolerable.
So in general, intensive reading, there is an organization of academics that researches all this stuff, and they say intensive reading is between 90 to 98% level of comprehension. And I just also put in the perspective, the reading pain, we're talking about like 1 in 10 characters you don't know. Now, you can still kind of manage that 1 in 10, but when you start dropping below, it gets even really, really hard. But you're stopping frequently. Intensive reading is, 90 to 98% level comprehension. So you were talking about maybe 1 in 10 to maybe like 1 in 20, maybe 1 in 30 characters you don't know. You do need a dictionary for this. And it still takes time. It's a bit more of a study reading. So this is a little bit more akin to like having a paragraph or an article like in a textbook or in some sort of curriculum, and you're kind of deliberately reading. So it's a little bit, like John, like you're saying, you're like active reading, right? It's a little bit more of that active reading, intensive reading. Research has shown that this does work a little bit better if you have someone there to help you through the text. So you have a tutor, a teacher, someone else who's more skilled in the language than you, who can help you through it. You can learn well doing that way as well.
Yeah, they can help provide more context and help you make more sense of what you're seeing. So definitely useful. I should mention, though, that even though textbooks are basically trying to do intensive reading and all their little passages, I think, especially for Chinese, there may be some textbooks that drop into the lower pain categories, like maybe 80 to 90%, rather than staying above 90%.
This is so true, John. And I think about because this is a little bit more my wheelhouse here, right? And talking about this, because I've gone to all these language conferences and to promote Mandarin Companion books, and and John, we had worked up that one banner I had put out there, and it represented what the different levels of reading are like, between 98, 90%, and 80% level comprehension. Right.
Yeah, so basically we took some passages, and what I did was I figured out ways to substitute characters for super obscure characters that no one would recognize. So it looks like, a word, but you can't read it. And in order to have a character that, an adult Chinese reader doesn't know, it has to be super obscure. And so it was really confusing to these, highly literate teachers going by and looking at this poster.
And what I would preface this by is saying, like, what do you think is like an optimal level of, comprehension or reading comprehension? What level of reading can people still learn? And I mean, it's really common for teachers, and not just teachers. I mean, you as a learner would think like, 80% is good enough, right? And I say, okay, all right, well then try this. And they go read the 80%, comprehension passage that's on this poster, and they're like, what's going on here? Wait, those characters are wrong. They first usually say that. But I say, like, do you have any idea what was being said in that paragraph? And generally, no. They don't know what's going on. And I say, well, okay, go ahead and read the 90, I think we had 95% and then the 98%, right? And of course, when they get the 98% comprehension, there's characters they don't know, but they can still kind of guess what those characters we're supposed to
Right.
mean, or and they can grasp the meaning from the text.
Okay, and that leads to the other type of reading, the best type of reading, you might say, which is extensive reading, and that is at 98% or better comprehension.
So to think about this is one character in 40 or 50 that you don't know. So when we read at this level, there's a lot of interesting and exciting things that kind of happen in our brain. So we are starting to read fluidly. All right, we're not stopping every other character or multiple times a sentence to look things up. We can start really begin to recognize and read long chunks of Chinese. And this is really important because you now get a better feel for the language. This helps you on starting to really more quickly parse the language. I mean, we talked about that earlier. Parsing is a really important skill. And also now you're going to be able to read dialogue. You're reading like things just a more fluid way, and you see how the characters and the words are used in many different contexts. Now, one of the most exciting things I love about extensive reading is the concept of automatic processing. Now, automatic processing, this is really a lot of times what we kind of equate to fluency, that F word, right? But it is that, in reading Chinese, oftentimes you'll read in Chinese and then you translate into your head in English or whatever your native language is. When automatic processing, it gets to that point where you stop you stop translating in your head and you actually start understanding it in Chinese. And one of the great things about extensive reading is that you start building a reading speed that's fast enough that you stop having the time to translate in your head. And that's a crutch. Like there's a lot of times you may be able to actually just understand in Chinese, but there's that habit, right? It can help break the habit, but also train your brain to just automatically understand that language. And because of this reason, this is why extensive reading, the research is the mountains of research behind this shows that it doesn't just improve your reading, but it improves your listening, your speaking, and of course your writing skills, because you can just begin comprehending the language. And so you just kind of, you know how to say things. You just kind of...
And Jared, it improves your mood.
Yeah, yes, it does improve your mood. I mean, how do you feel when you can read Chinese?
Yeah, but the thing about automatic processing that some people don't quite get is that it's not a switch that is suddenly flipped. It's something that gradually builds up, and then eventually it kind of hits this threshold where you really feel it. So to give an example, when someone says ni hao, like, are you translating in your head? Oh, ni hao, that means hi. Like, you're not. Like, you probably know that. It's just that a lot of other things you don't know. But little by little, you're building up these chunks of language, these sentences, and over time, they make a big difference until you really are automatically processing large chunks of language, and you're just like, whoa.
And this is really important because that's when you, like, the different stages of reading, what's happening in our brain is that you go from reading word by word to reading chunks of languages to reading with ideas. And so, like, even right now, like I'm speaking English. I have this idea in my head of what I want to say, and I just open my mouth and the words come out. I'm not thinking about every single word that I'm saying. And listening to me, you are not listening to every word and carefully parsing and thinking about every word. You just kind of hear me speaking and you understand what I'm saying. So, obviously I can automatically process English, and you can automatically process English as well in understanding me. And so this is what extensive reading can really train our brain to do. And this is why it can be such a huge boost to fluency and proficiency in a language.
All right, and just in case you missed this, graded readers are a form of extensive reading, but it's certainly not the only form of extensive reading. So one thing that people sometimes don't realize is that as an advanced learner, you don't always have to be reading something that's super hard, that's full of chengyu and really difficult words. Like, it's good to read stuff that's easy. And there might be an occasional word you don't know. That's extensive reading, and that's good for you. Like, hopefully you're enjoying it. But that's good reading practice too.
Yeah, and I will say this for advanced learners, and I've come across these people, and you do too, John, is that, maybe they know, like, I know 3,000 characters, and I have like 8,000 words, that type of a thing. But their reading speed it's halting. It's like, it's very slow. Reading speed is an excellent indicator of proficiency. And so I recommend that, hey, even if you know all the words in a book, but your reading speed is really slow, take the time to build that reading speed. And building that reading speed, that's what it really does, is it really builds that ability for your brain to automatically process the language and really has immense benefits for your fluency in the language.
Okay, so I think that's about everything we wanted to cover today, but let me just do a quick summary. So we started out by talking about decoding and how Chinese is a little different than English in that regard. And then as far as techniques, we talked about skimming, scanning, and active reading. Remember, skimming and scanning are a bit tougher in Chinese, so that'll take some time. And then we wrapped it up with the types of reading, including reading pain, intensive reading, and extensive reading.
That's right. So bottom line, you can learn Chinese. You can read Chinese, and by reading Chinese, it has a lot of benefits for your language development. And as you improve those skills, there's going to be a lot more things you can do with that scanning, skimming, and I think it's important just kind of have a point of reference on that, so you kind of know where you're at and what type of reading you're trying to do.
And you don't have to choose pain every time. You can learn Chinese.
All right, now it's time for a word from our sponsor. And today our sponsor is
AllSet Learning. So today we're talking about online courses. So AllSet Learning is my company, the one behind the Chinese Grammar Wiki. And we also have online courses which are live, one-on-one courses with native speakers. We have book club courses focused on Mandarin companion books like The Secret Garden. We also have discussion courses focused on IT, the office, business stuff. We even have HSK mod courses, which they use the popular HSK textbooks, but rather than being totally focused on the test, it's more focused on using the vocabulary and grammar in conversation. So we got lots of good stuff, and we're doing a holiday sale right now called Winter Cheer. So if you're interested, come to allsetlearning.com, or you can look for the link in the show notes and check out what courses we have on sale now.
Now, I'll give a quick personal testimony. I've been back here in the States for a number of years now, and I'm doing one of the book courses. Funny enough, I'm like co-founder of Mandarin Companion. And so I'm doing a course based on one of our books with one of the teachers. And John, she doesn't know who I am, right?
No, she does not. She just thinks you're some guy that likes The Secret Garden.
And it's been actually really fun. I mean, I know the story, helped create the story, but it's been a lot of fun to, have a discussion about literature in Chinese with this teacher. And it's been helping me fix some little areas, in my Chinese and just kind of making sure I'm keeping my Chinese up. So definitely can recommend these courses. They're great.
Yeah, and the good thing about a discussion course is that it could be adjusted for level. It's a discussion, and the teachers are good teachers, so they can, make it a little bit more challenging for someone with a higher language skills. So it's good stuff.
Obviously, my Chinese skills are much above that level 1 in Mandarin Companion, but yeah, even for me, it's great to have a great discussion about it. All right, now it's time for Rants and Raves. John, what do you have for us today? Do you have a rant or do you have a rave?
I have a rave. So I've been doing this Substack newsletter called ARC, Advanced Readings in Chinese. And through that, I've come across another Substack newsletter, which is called Andrew Methven's Slow Chinese, 每周漫闻. And it's basically about the latest language trends in Chinese, like across Chinese media. So it's mostly English, but there's just tons of Chinese vocabulary. And it's pretty advanced, but because it's in English, even if you're not going to use these words, it's still pretty interesting. And I feel like every newsletter, even if you're not advanced, you can pick up something interesting. So definitely worth a look. It's called Slow Chinese, but it's not the one that, from years ago with the audio, like with the news. It's a different one. It's a newsletter based on like popular keywords in Chinese media.
Wow, that's kind of cool. And so where can we find that?
So it's a Substack newsletter. You can search for Andrew Methven, Methven, Slow Chinese, and you'll find it for sure.
Fantastic.
All right, and Jared, what do you got? Rant or rave?
I have got a rave. All right, I found this, I think it was on Reddit or something, but this was really cool. There's this website called Radio.Garden. All right, and so what this website does is it's like almost like a Google Earth map, and it has radio stations from all over the world, like on this globe. Okay, so you can rotate the globe, and it has like a little circle in the middle, and you kind of highlight it over a dot somewhere on the map, and it has all online radio stations from that city. So the cool thing about this for Chinese is that not surprisingly, there are lots of radio stations in China. I think Shanghai alone has something, 50, 60. But like, for example, in Shanghai, there's 12 radio stations online. So they can have music, but there's talk, traffic radio, all this type of stuff. So you can go Beijing. There's all things down in Guangzhou. You can even there's having some Kunming radio stations, some stuff, a little like Inner Mongolia. Anyway, so it was really cool, and I spent some time on here. I'm like, wow, this is cool, this is neat, and listening to some Chinese radio stations. Now, obviously, this might be for maybe not be for the beginner, but if you're going to learn some things, hey, learn about some traffic, right, and listen to the traffic radio, right? The appropriate times.
Wait, so this is all streaming, right? Like you can't download it?
Yeah, it's all streaming, so it's all live radio. And, of course, you can listen to any other radio station. I mean, there's literally thousands across Europe and Americas, North and South America. Gosh, even stuff all over Africa and India. It's really cool. So even for any world language learners, you can find radio stations just from anywhere in pretty much all languages.
Okay, so that's Radio.Garden?
Yep, and we'll put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, my name is Sebastian. I've been in China for the past 5 years working as a strategy consultant. Now I'm at an automotive supplier working the strategy. But after work and on the weekends, I also love to work on my Xiaohongshu account, which is called 德国小哥苏天, where I share in Chinese about my experiences here in China.
Sebastian is focused and driven with an infectious enthusiasm. Listen how he's taken his passion for Chinese and is using it in new and creative ways. Stay with us. Why did you start learning Chinese?
Actually, it's a bit of a funny story. I originally wanted to go to Korea or Japan. I was 25, now I'm 30, and I wanted to make an exchange in Asia. And then when I applied for Japan and Korea for the university, I got rejected. And then I made another try half a year later, and I got accepted in China.
You applied to Korea. That didn't work out, but why did you say, oh, well, I'm going to keep going? Why did you decide to go ahead and apply to universities in China?
I mean, it all started when I was 18. I was the first time in Southeast Asia, and I liked the whole vibe. So I wanted to kind of break out of Europe. So I was equally open for that.
Wow. Okay. So you said, all right, well, I'll go ahead and apply. You got into Fudan University, which is a great university. It's in Shanghai, right? What did you come to study? Because, I mean, it's not like every day people just say, I'm just going to apply to a Chinese university.
Yeah, I mean, I arrived. It was all in English, the studies. So that was a bit the thing, because I didn't speak Chinese. So it was together with Chinese people and foreign people, but in English, studying business administration at the School of Management. And during that time, I also then started to have an internship in a consulting firm. And I immediately started studying Chinese like crazy, because I knew that if I want to stay after my studies in China, Chinese will be very good. Let's say it has a lot of plus points to it. Yeah.
Maybe you could explain some of the dynamics, because I do know there's a lot of people who will come to China and some will say, hey, I'm going to start really learning Chinese, and some maybe not, right? Because you were in an English environment. You're in a Chinese university, you're in China, but your classes were all in English, right? So at what point did you say, hey, I'm really going to get serious about learning Chinese? And what do you think is the difference between those students who did and didn't?
Yeah, I mean, the word 脸皮很厚. Like my face skin is very thick. And I think this is the most important thing you have to do when you come to China. You have to be not shy to just speak Chinese. And that was really my secret. I mean, most of my classmates, they were Chinese. But I started speaking Chinese to them. They talked to me in English, but I just spoke Chinese, even though it was super basic. But I went crazy right at it and wasn't shy of making any mistakes. I made thousands of mistakes. It was super awkward at sometimes. Another big thing I did is, yes, there were many foreigners and they all wanted to connect, like, oh yeah, oh, you're from Germany, and they all want to be like your friends, and they all go party and everything, and they all live in the student dorm. I did different decisions. I didn't move to the student dorm. I lived in the city because I saw all these foreigners who've been there for so many years and they didn't speak any Chinese. So that was for me like the nightmare. Waking up one day after 10 years, I'm still sorry to say, but like the stupid Lao Wai, Ting Bu Dong. Like he doesn't understand anything about the culture and the language. So for me, I was like almost fanatic about learning Chinese. So I put myself in a fully Chinese environment, lived together with 2 Chinese girls. And the other thing, which I equally avoided, was all the Chinese who saw me as an English teacher, because I knew if I hang out with them, I will still be speaking English all the time. So I went really for the Chinese people who are happy to talk to me in Chinese, even though it would be awkward, it would be difficult because I don't speak much, but they would have fun just being around with me.
But like, what did you really do like to get started?
So just 3 weeks before I went to China, I just downloaded all the apps I could find, like all the Duolingos and all the things I could find, and actually looked for some Chinese people in Germany already I can talk to, even though it was really basic, but I found some students and I talked some sentences. So I had a first idea what the language would be like. And then when I came to China, what I did was I went to a Chinese class, but abandoned it after 1 week because there were mostly other people, foreigners who've been in China for many years, but didn't learn much. So I went out on the streets. And what if I mean out of the streets, I really mean out of the streets. So I had the most basic words in sentences which you can have. And I went to the Ais, for all the ones who don't know what it means, like the ladies on the street selling fruits, cleaning up, all the security guys standing in some gateways who are not very busy and are happy to talk to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what was funny was the first day I got lost right away in the streets because I lived in Laoximen, which is really the old part of Shanghai. Yeah?
I love that area.
Yeah, a lot got teared down, sadly, now, but there were like all these old shops, like the fish flying out on the street. And I just got lost, and then I found this door. I walked in, I saw some old ladies and wanted to ask for the way. And they just like pulled me over and were like, like touching me. And I was like, confused, like these old ladies. And then I found out it's a massage shop. Not the massage you might think, I really like about Chinese massage. And they were like, and I couldn't understand them. And then I had a massage there for like 45 kwai, 1 hour, which is like $5 or something. I was talking to them like for 3 hours on end. I was lost in Shanghai, just next to my house. It was actually, I found out later, it was just 1 minute from my house, but I felt lost. And I was chatting with them for 3 hours with sign language, anything. And I was learning so much. Like for anyone who's coming to Shanghai, to China, the people are super, super friendly and happy to talk to a foreigner because many of them never had the chance to. And also my flatmates, they were Taiwanese girls. So I sounded very, if you want to say camp or nyang, because I had a very girlish Chinese in the beginning. So I talked to them all day. And I don't know what was the feeling for you the first time speaking Chinese, but for me, it was like a magical skill. It felt like I have a supernatural ability now. I just kept on learning super fast. I then also, like here comes the cliche, but I had a Chinese girlfriend then, of course.
Yes.
And she spoke perfect English. I mean, you always say it, right? Aprendes un idioma en la cuna o en la cama. It's like in Spanish means you learn the language either in the bed or when you are a child in the cradle. And she was like the first 6 months like pushing me like crazy because she spoke perfect English, but she knew I love to learn Chinese, so she just spoke to me in Chinese.
I think of some times where I've spoken to, some Chinese people, usually in some smaller areas or smaller towns when I've been traveling. I remember one time asking this girl, like, have you ever seen a foreigner before? And she's like, yes. Had you ever talked to a foreigner before? She's like, no, you're the first one I've ever spoken with, right? And that's very common.
And they ask you 100 questions because they're like, now I have the chance. This old guy, like maybe 70 or 60 years old, and now he can ask all the questions he always had. Of course, some of these questions are very funny, like about how much money you earn, about politicians, about all these things, about German cars, beer.
It's almost like there's an innocence about the questions, right? It's just because they're so curious.
And you have to be, of course, very open and tolerant. Like if you are conservative and like, no, then it doesn't work. Like sometimes they ask you really things you are not believing. I mean, for example, many people to me, if I say German, they say Hitler. And then I looked up the word, it means Hitler. And they ask me really funny questions about Hitler because they're just like, whoa, who's this guy? And tell me more. And some of them even have a more positive opinion because, as a German, we have a very negative opinion about it. We learn it all the time that this was a bad guy. But for Chinese, it's like a strong leader sometimes. And yeah, you have to be just open, have a mindset and not judge, but like try to explain it to them. I often tell them, yeah, we actually have a different opinion. And yeah, it's an innocent in there in some of these questions, yes.
You had some great progress here, and you mentioned the honeymoon period, right? So you're like, wow, everything's opening up. I can communicate, right? But how did things progress from there?
So for me, it was, I started now feeling like I'm not the Lao Wai. I mean, you will always be the Lao Wai. I felt like I'm getting out of this. I felt like I had this magical tool, and I've been actually back to Germany for 1 week, 2 weeks, and I felt like a superstar. Like I felt like, wow, I'm now a master and I speak Chinese and I'm the guy. And even with a shirt, I came back with a big Chinese character on it, like which means like the crane. And I felt like, okay, this is the thing. Actually, I also, if I remember now, I was like once mentioning to a guy like, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of now where I should be, but I want to make it a little bit more perfect. And if I think back to this one sentence, I feel super embarrassed now if I look at it. Because I'm 5 years in and I still feel like I know nothing. A bit like, nothing, yep. Jon Snow from Game of Thrones. It's like, I think everyone has encountered that. And I think I had it after the 7-8 month when I noticed there's so many characters I don't know. There's so many tones I make wrong. There's so many words I don't know that I got kind of into this little depression. Or there was a cartoon where it's like you've climbed the first hill and you're like, okay, I'm at the top. And then you look and you just see a huge mountain behind it. And this feeling I had after 6 months, I would say. And it pulled me down in the beginning. Also, then looking at other foreigners who are much better than me made me even more depressed. You're like, wow, you never be like them. And you see them like kind of superstars. And they're like, yeah, I work in Chinese. And I was like working in Chinese, but it was more like awkward conversations. It wasn't like talking about any business problems and things. Yeah. So yeah, that was depressing.
I can relate to that. I remember once someone told me his 4 stages of learning Chinese. 1, you know nothing. 2, you think you know everything. 3, you're afraid you'll never know anything. 4, you realize you know just a little bit.
And you have to be fine with a little bit. And that's my approach. Then you'll be like, okay, I know like 1% now. And that's great. I know 1%. And then you have to kind of remind yourself why you do this thing, that it's not for the final goal. It sounds so cliche, but really like be in love with the process. I enjoyed all these things, all these conversations at parties with these Aris on the street, like all these things. I enjoyed it. Why should I pull myself down that I'm still at a beginner level? Yeah, just enjoy it. Enjoy the process. It can only get better. Yeah, and with every new character, every new tone, every new word you learn, you advance. One breakthrough I actually had, like when I felt like I made it, is really 2 situations, which I sometimes have. For example, I really love rock climbing, and sometimes I go on outdoor trips with my Chinese friends to climb on the walls. And then when we start discussing about how to climb the route and talk about the technical gear and all the body movements in Chinese with all the Chinese friends, and I just sit there and no one says your Chinese is amazing. No one notices you as a foreigner. These are like these special moments. I think you had them as well, and many advanced Chinese learners had them, where you feel like, wow, yes, I invested 4 years of my life every day, like learning and learning. And now it paid off. This is just one of the magical moments I just wanted to share with you.
I'm glad you brought this up, because I think really when you get to the point of your Chinese really being good is that nobody mentions it, because it's a little bit insulting. I talk about that as if you were coming across a Chinese person in America who speaks like near like perfect English, you're not going to say, it's like, oh, your English is so good, right? It's just kind of like understood. It's almost like trite or a little condescending to go ahead and say that at that stage, right? But you get to the point where nobody mentions your Chinese at all. It's so good, there's nothing to say about it, right?
Exactly. This is like the magical moment. And I have it more with older people. So actually, it's funny, like really old people, when they talk to you in Chinese and their Putonghua, their Mandarin, is often not that good as well. And when you talk to them in Mandarin, they look at you. And some of them, they have never left their village or their small town, and they're not even 100% sure if you're Chinese or maybe a foreigner, or maybe you are really from just Xinjiang or some really far away place. And when you then speak a proper Chinese, they don't care. They want to know where the supermarket is. They ask you about any mundane question that they actually want to talk to you about, but it's not about you being a foreigner. And there's like this whole foreigner Chinese thing just suddenly doesn't exist. And also with young people, I have it sometimes when I just talk, and it's right in the beginning, and all my friends are with me, and a new person joins in the meeting, and we're all talking Chinese. They also just talk to me naturally, and this is like the biggest present I think that Chinese people can give to you. They just take you as one of them.
That's really great. That's really cool. I've watched your videos. Your Chinese is very good. You have an account on Xiaohongshu. It's more for like influencers. It's a little bit like TikTok, right? When you're making videos for people. So maybe you could talk about how do you feel like you got to that point, even getting to the point where I'm making videos now for Chinese people?
Yeah, exactly. I'm on Xiaohongshu, which can be kind of called the Instagram of China. Xiaohongshu, like Little Red Book. In English, it's called Red, R-E-D. And I have an account there. It's called 德国小哥苏田, which means German boy Sutian.
We'll put a link in the show notes, so if anyone wants to find your channel, we can do that.
But yeah, I started that actually just 2 months ago. I said like every week, like 1, 2, 3 videos kind of. And it's all short videos about me talking about my experiences in China from a very unique lens. And even though I just started, I have like 4,000 followers now. I have like over 15,000 likes on all my videos. And I have sometimes up to 2,000 comments for one video with pages long of comments, and I have to answer them, most of them all. So it's super engaging, and that's really the thing for everyone here. It doesn't matter where your Chinese level is. I think it's a really nice opportunity to actually also improve your Chinese. In just the 2 months now of doing this, you learn so much. Because you hear yourself in the editing process. You have to prepare the scripts. You have to prepare a text for describing the video. You have to make all the tones perfect while you're practicing the recording. So it's another great tool for me to practice Chinese.
Why did you decide to even start doing these videos?
The main reason really is that all my Chinese friends I meet every day, and even new people I meet, they're all like, hey dude, you know what you should do? Your Chinese is good. You like to talk. You have all these kind of different ideas and special views on how Chinese people do things, and you bring them in your cultural context. You should start making videos and share it with an audience. And I heard it, and I'm not lying to you, maybe 50 times within 2 years.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, yeah, I will do it sometime. I'll do it sometime. And, I have this huge response. I just started, and, I have like 100,000 views on some videos. I have all these like thousands of comments. So I think that was the main reason why I got started.
I think something I'm interested to hear from you is like, what are some of those key questions, that maybe Chinese people are curious about, like foreigners, or things maybe they're not aware of or maybe not understand about, maybe the European or the Western world? One
example is, for example, I made a video on why you should not tell a foreigner your Chinese is really good. Why not? So I gave like really different perspective, and yes, please feel free to look on the Xiaohongshu, and it's also with English subtitles, by the way, so also good for Chinese learning, and you can see what my answer is. Or for example, I made a video on actually all Chinese people speak a little bit of German, because Chinese people always say hello when they speak English, and they don't say hello. And in German, actually, hallo means hello. So I made this little joke, and then I made a little bit of more, gave deeper context on language and on communication. Or there was another video I just published, which had like 100,000 views now, is on 中国人很能忍. It means like Chinese people are really good at holding out pressure. And it's really a thing I noticed. Chinese people, they can sleep under a megaphone. They can... Yes. I made this video which I cut in, and grandpa who sit in a coffee shop, and next to him there was a guy with a jackhammer. It was really, the table was shaking. And he's just having his coffee there, his 60-year-old grandpa. And this is like a supernatural skill that Chinese people have, in my view. And I made a video on that, 3 minutes, just talking about this, and how it's in Germany, how sensitive we are to noise. And it goes crazy. Like, people love it because it's something they encounter every day, but they never thought about it actively. And this is like the content I bring to a Chinese audience. And this is how I can build up this tribe, I would say, of followers who like to engage with me.
I've called that before the Chinese superpower, right? Just seem to fall asleep anywhere. I think one of my favorites once is on a scooter. I saw a dad driving a scooter, and his kid was turned around backwards, and there's like a little case on the back of the scooter, and the kid just sprawled over this case asleep on the scooter. They're bouncing around on the road, cars and beeping, everything.
Where every German child would be fully on adrenaline and panicking in the crazy Shanghai traffic. It's so funny, yeah.
All right, Sebastian, we've talked a lot about oral proficiency, right? You've talked about speaking Chinese, but I haven't really gotten it clear, like, how did you really learn characters and learn to read?
First of all, there's some foreigners who believe that they don't need to read characters, they can just speak it, because there's some Chinese who can actually not read, and they speak it, but I think it's a really wrong approach, because in my opinion, actually, characters are the best tool to help you speak better Chinese, because many foreigners are great mnemonics. They can, when I speak, I often think in characters. Or when you talk to others, you often explain yourself names or certain things in characters. And for me, it's so often that really with having characters in my mind, my speaking improves a lot. So the first thing, I would suggest everyone who says, I don't need the characters, I think it's a great help. It's not only a burden, it's more of a help. The second thing, do you want to learn characters or is it nice? Oh, yes, man, it's super nice. Why is it super nice? I mean, once I sat in the metro in Berlin, in my hometown in Germany, and I was reading a book in Chinese, and people were looking at me, and yes, it's I don't want to show off, but it's like when you sit there and you read your book in Chinese, it's kind of, it feels funny because you read these characters which were some years before were just like, they didn't mean anything. It was just like some weird things. It could mean nothing. It was more like abstract art. And now you're just reading and flying through these characters. I mean, this really also drives you. It's not just speaking, but you can read the language and you can absorb all the knowledge and you improve. And with every character you learn new, you have this kind of super nice feeling of success. I mean, you can count the characters you know. So it feels a bit like a video game where you can really upgrade and upgrade and upgrade. So I think it's super motivating. It helps you to speak better.
I always remember this point when I was living in China and learning Chinese, where like the streets became alive because I could start reading signs.
Oh yeah.
I'm like, oh, well, that's a barber shop. I can get my hair cut there. Oh, this was some sort of pharmacy or whatever. Like you couldn't read those before, and you just never really knew what was going on. And now It's like, wow, the streets are alive.
In learning these characters, I am a freaking nerd. I stand on the metro station where thousands of people running around and I read the security signs or read the signs on the fire extinguisher to learn these words and stand there with my phone and type them off. And I did it for days and weeks and years on end because it's just so much fun. So please, if you learn Chinese, don't be afraid of the characters. It's just fun.
Yeah. Sebastian, if you could go back and you could give some advice to yourself when you had just started learning Chinese, what advice would you give yourself, and maybe what would you also do differently?
I think one really important thing is I got so crazy about collecting new words, even still, that I use Anki and I have like 70,000 words saved in Anki in my vocabulary app. Yeah, and it's just, it sounds cool, but I've repeated a fraction of them, and I'm kind of crazy about collecting new words, even words which you've never used again, like very specific chemicals or materials. And this kind of is an addiction. I wish I could lie off, but I still cannot actually do it. It's really an addiction, and I should have invested more of all these times, like these hundreds of hours in typing of words, actually on reading more and speaking more. So that's the first advice. Try to get a bit away from collecting all this knowledge into your databases and go more into reading and speaking with people. I mean, this is really like the key thing where you can learn much faster because what you speak about is actually what you really need. But when you read some weird words again on the fire extinguisher, I doubt that you will talk about fire extinguishers again in a year or maybe even in 2. So that's the first thing.
True.
The second thing is, started 3 months ago again, on focusing on my tones. And if you see my videos on Xiaohongshu, I mean, I speak very fluently. Yeah, I use very proper words, technical words, everything. But my tones, especially my second tone, gets off quite a bit. Yeah, and this is the thing. In the beginning, I was like abandoned all Chinese classes. I don't need it. I have my friends, my ayis, my shushus. I can learn with them. I will learn the natural street way. But later on, now I notice actually no. At some point you need some professional guidance, and this is really for the tones and the pronunciation of words. So now I went back to AllSet learning actually, and I started having classes there to really be drilled crazy on my tones. But some of these mistakes are so deeply ingrained in me that it's so hard to change them. It's so much work, and I'm complaining to John like, I've been out 10 hours. Why? Like I improved a lot, yes. And all my friends tell me you've improved a lot, but still I make the same mistakes. Especially when I speak fast, and I love to speak fast. That's where my tones often get off. So yeah, this would be the second thing, like, or maybe sum it up. Like one thing is really focus less on writing down all the words, but more speaking and reading, like practical learning of Chinese. And the second thing is really focus on the tones and the pronunciation from the beginning. Otherwise, you have a lot of work later on correcting them.
Wow, that is really good advice. And actually, I'm going through a little bit of a similar process right now. I'm trying to kind of correct some wrong pronunciations, and I have some bad grammar at different points I use, and it's hard to fix that, right?
It's super hard.
It's what 习惯的错误, right?
Yeah.
English would say it's a fossilized problem. It's hard to change. So yeah,
exactly.
Everyone learning, go back and try to get this stuff right the first time.
Get it right the first time, yeah. And because especially when you later plan to be close to native level, and this is where I'm really heading, like for I want to at some point, and sometimes happens when I have a phone call actually, that they think For example, at Bosch, the company I work for, automotive company, I call the customer service or the internal HR, and I explain them about my problem for a minute. And then they ask me, okay, what is the name of the employee? And I say, it's Sebastian. And then they're like, yeah, okay, but that's a foreign name. I need your name. And I'm like, yeah, that's me, the foreigner. And then they're like, wow. And then like, I didn't notice that you're a foreigner. And this is like the moment where like, one thing is, yes, you're super happy. But yeah, this is what I want to get to every time. Because that was a funny thing, because I talked for like 1 minute about very familiar topics. But can you do it when you're on a stage and speak, or when you're on a podcast like this and no one sees you and they really think you're Chinese? That's super, super hard. Yeah, and this is where I want to head for. And yeah, this is, if I would have focused on the tones much earlier, I would maybe be there already.
Well, that's great advice, I think, for all of us.
And a third advice is really, don't stay in a non-Chinese environment for too long. And I made this mistake. Actually, for 3 years, I was working in a strategy consulting firm with 4 German colleagues and like 20 Chinese colleagues. And because all the German colleagues didn't speak any Chinese, the whole company language was English. And when I want to speak Chinese, everyone was kind of looking at me like, who's this weird guy? Oh, he wants to prove he's better than the German colleagues, etc. So actually, I wasted 3 years, every day at least 8 to 10 hours, not speaking Chinese at all. And this has thrown me back a lot. And I was like so crying inside, because I was like, I lost 3 years of a lot of practice actually along the way. So everyone out there, if you are in a company or an environment that doesn't want you to practice your Chinese, then change it better earlier than later. Otherwise, after a couple of years, you are still there and didn't make the process you want to. And now I joined a Bosch automotive company, and it's really cool. Like, the colleagues there are super nice. I speak to all of them in Chinese, and they really understand it. Actually, to some of them, I start now speaking in Shanghainese, because I learned the local dialect right now, which is super fun.
Wow.
And yeah, that's an environment you need. And really get out of these non-conducive environments. Go to the people that really support you in your Chinese language learning. Be in the right environment.
Well, Sebastian, I think this has been really insightful, and if someone wants to be able to find you on Xiaohongshu, they can find you, through the link in the show notes and see some of your videos. They're really insightful. And like I said, yeah, like you did mention, they also have English subtitles, so it's a good way to practice some of the Chinese English a little bit.
Actually, that's something I did. I watched a lot of foreigners speaking about their life in China in Chinese, and I learned a lot of Chinese actually from them. There are a lot of good ones. For example, Ma Saray or Afu, they speak really, really, really good Chinese, yeah. And also, of course, please feel free to put my LinkedIn link in there. I'm called there Sebastian Mueller Su Tian, like all together. Also with my Chinese name, Su is like the Su from Suzhou, and Tian is from the field, like Tianyuan the Tian. Feel free to add me. Feel free to send me any questions on LinkedIn. I just pushed out a post on my HSK6, which had like 100,000 views, and I had lots of Chinese learners connecting me, asking me for advice, and I really enjoyed that. So please feel free. Let's get connected. Let me give you advice on how to improve. And yeah, I'm really happy to connect with you guys.
Well, thanks, Sebastian. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here on our podcast. This was really cool.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it as well.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, mother, interior designer, farmer, educator, actor, scientist, trainer, maitre d', and that one gal named Abigail. You can subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review so we know how we're doing. You can find us on Facebook and at mandarincompanion.com. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor is Kaiser Guo at SupChina, and our interview editor is James Harper with Filter Productions. I'd like to thank our guest, Sebastian Mueller, and of course, thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Pasden. See you next time.